Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's really such an honor to be invited to be here. As it was mentioned, I was fortunate to have Dr. Miller as an attending, and he was such a kind, gentle, unassuming physician and a superb and elegant surgeon. And it was during my last year of residency that he passed away. It was such a shock to all of us. And over the years, as I've scrubbed for surgery, particularly for difficult cases, I would often call Dr. Miller to mind and actually ask for his help during those cases. So it's really an honor to be here, a double honor to lecture in the name of this man that was such an important influence on me and has remained a part of my career through all these years. So this photo was from 31 years ago on this night. My co-residents put me in a grass skirt and a coconut bra and sent me off into the Pacific. Some months earlier, I had decided to put off the retina fellowships that I had applied for and pursue this dream of working internationally in an underserved area. I was coming off the heels of something that no one in their 20s should go through, particularly during a residency, and that was a disintegration of a young marriage. So it was something that was really hard on me and something that I did not share with many people because I had a really deep sense of failure as a result of that, just as a human being. So I think this decision to go internationally was also in part an opportunity to move away from that pain, that sense of failure, and to heal. So I signed a one-year contract and took a pay cut from my residency salary and headed to the LBJ Tropical Medical Center in the Samoan Islands, where I'd be the only ophthalmologist for 70,000 people. And on this map, the orange is the anchoring at the top is the Hawaiian Islands, and if you go south 4 hours, you get to the Samoan Islands. And there's a lot of clusters of islands throughout the Pacific. So during that first year in particular, I had to do a lot with very little. And I remember calling Dr. Listener and asking him for advice on a particularly difficult orbital case. And after hearing that I had no CT or MRI, very limited resources, no instruments, he did the only thing he could do. He said, "Good luck." I didn't call Dr. Listener again. I realized I was all alone, thousands of miles from the nearest ophthalmologist, and I had to just figure it out. As I did cases, many times I just have the textbook open on the Mayo stand. And I'd say to myself, well, someone had to do this case for the very first time. At least I have a book. I did a lot of extracapsular cataract surgery, and the Simcoe cannula was my best friend. I was doing about 1 ruptured globe per week, and with no laser, I just watched the diabetics go blind. At the time, of course, there were no biologics, and it was during that year that I made some of the best friends of my life. After a year, my contract was ending and the equipment was breaking down, and it was time to move back to pursue the fellowship. But during that year, I'd fallen in love with the Pacific and I'd fallen in love with the girl. So I decided to stay in the Pacific for 1 more year. Much of this water continent still today lacks the resources to support eye care. But I heard that there was a government hospital on the island of Saipan in the Mariana Islands, which was ready for an ophthalmologist. So I packed my bags and headed to the Western Pacific, where all of those airlines are coming down from Japan. And I was the only ophthalmologist there again. So a year later, Mara and I were married there. We raised 4 children there, and the Retina Fellowship is still waiting. We spent the next 21 years of our lives there on Saipan. And this sign hangs in the operating room there. If you have to have everything you need to do the case, you probably shouldn't be here. And that goes for much of global ophthalmology. After 5 years with the government hospital, I reached the limit of what I could do to improve care under the government, and with the blessing of the Ministry of Health, we opened Mariana's Eye Institute, which continues to be the only source of ophthalmic care for the 80,000 population there. Much of the work is centered on cataracts and trauma. There's a lot of diabetic retinopathy. We were able to bring in phaco, a laser, OCT. We hooked up Avastin to a hose and just watched it do its magic. With no experience or training beyond treating disease, I was in the trenches learning how to build an eye care system where none previously existed in an underserved area under challenging circumstances. And I was totally, miserably unqualified to do that. But with the help of a lot of people, I was figuring it out. And later, I found out that this activity is called global ophthalmology. Now, there are even global ophthalmology fellowships that you can do, and I'm sure if they existed at the time, I would have liked to have done one. In 2014, we left the Mariana Islands for the Czech Republic, driven by my oldest daughter's desire for a bigger high school experience than the 5 by 10 mile island had to offer, and driven by Mara's island fever. Unable to practice medicine in Europe because of licensing and language requirements, I taught at the international boarding school our children were attending. And it was at that time I entered the broader world of global ophthalmology, where I went to India for training in manual small incision cataract surgery, as well as did the first of my regular trips to Africa. I spent a year in Virginia, and at that time I was invited to build the global ophthalmology program at UVA, and moved back to Europe, where I continue to attempt to lead the program from Portugal, where we've lived for 2 years. During COVID, the boarding school in the Czech Republic had a lot of difficulties, and so we ended up having 7 students come from there to live with us. So we've had a rather unique experience over the last 2 years with 7 teenagers in the house. So, the work in global ophthalmology over the years has taken me to all continents under a variety of conditions. And I think that what I can offer you today is to share some of my experiences and the things I've learned, some stories and some of the questions that I have. And I hope that they'll encapsulate some of the key challenges and opportunities in the field and some things for you to consider. I hope that some of you may be inspired to take part in this kind of work. So global ophthalmology is fundamentally an activity of bringing eye care to those who don't have access to it. And in the current global system, where access to money and access to healthcare typically go hand in hand, global ophthalmology by necessity is work that is focused on the needs of the poor. Although we think of global ophthalmology as an activity that involves going to exotic places, it's fundamentally about bringing eye care to all, even at home. Much of the focus of my work in recent years has been in Ethiopia, and most of the photos you'll see are to paint a picture of the conditions there, which in many ways are representative of conditions around the world. So in October 2019, I was in Ethiopia with the Himalayan Cataract Project, or HCP, for 2 weeks of high-volume cataract surgery in these camp settings, where 5 surgeons would together perform 1,000 to 1,500 cataracts in a week. The best of the surgeons do between 85 and 120 manual small incision cataract surgeries in a day. To put this work within context, Ethiopia is a country of 120 million people with some of the highest rates of cataract blindness in the world. And over the past 10 years, HCP has been working methodically to raise the level of eye care at all levels. One area of focus is the most immediate problem, clearing the backlog of cataract blindness through these high-volume campaigns. Currently, there's a backlog of 600,000 cataracts in Ethiopia. The blindness rates are connected to poverty. The percentage of the U.S. population that earns less than $10 per day is 2.75%. In Ethiopia, it's 96%. So during this first trip, I met this young girl, Inania, who showed up to the camp. She was 10 years old, and she was bilaterally blind at this young age from cataracts. She'd been blind probably for about a year. and she shared a story through a translator. She said, "Both my parents are dead. My mother committed suicide. My father died of a sickness. A relative of my dad takes care of me now. I used to go to school, but last year my teacher told me to quit since I couldn't see. I was disappointed. The teacher did not explain anything to me. He saw me struggling to copy from the blackboard and yelled at me. He even beat me, and he turned to my friend and said, 'Tell her never to come back to school.' I cried a lot, especially when I saw my friends going to school. I'm so happy to have my sight back. Most importantly, I'm excited to go back to school." And hers is not an unusual story of tragedies that are ordinary, of early death of parents from sickness or worse, of reversible bilateral blindness that robs people of their education, their livelihoods, and their dignity. Ananya is one of 19 million people in the world who are blind from cataracts, which of course is a problem with a well-defined surgical solution. And the vast majority of those 19 million people live in countries of rampant poverty that we call the low and middle income countries of the world. Global blindness, particularly reversible blindness, is very closely distributed by income, both of individuals and income of nations. So this problem of access by the poor is the fundamental problem that we face and that we seek to overcome in global ophthalmology. So we go to the places where the care is needed and we provide that care. Sometimes it's through surgery, and others through clinical care. We go as doctors and we just simply do our thing. A second way we solve the problem of inadequate access to care is through training. I took my third trip to Ethiopia last month, not to do surgery but to teach. First to give lectures at the National Resident Review course in Addis Ababa. Then after the course, I flew south with the residents from Hawassa University for a week of wet labs and indirect ophthalmoscopy skills. Hawassa has 16 residents and 2 attendings who are both comprehensive ophthalmologists. Dr. Arga is the head of the program. After completing his MD in Ethiopia, he went to Tel Aviv to get an MPH and returned to Ethiopia and for about 10 years worked in HIV/AIDS. He then went on to do an ophthalmology residency and is now heading the program at Hawassa about 2 years out of his own training. For these 15 residents and 2 faculty members, the program has 4 slit lamps and 1 indirect ophthalmoscope. And so these are the realities that brought me there. And I'll admit, I have doubts about the effectiveness of these kind of teaching trips. Certainly the impact is more immediate when you're going to do surgery, particularly cataract surgery. When you see that the difficult circumstances under which the residents are trying to learn, I really wonder, am I doing anything by being here for a week or even a month? But this trip cleared this up for me, and I'd like to share with you how. On Thursday morning of that week, Dr. Arga took me to see a patient with him. Yesterday, he had told me about the man in his early 30s whose family pit bull had attacked him and caused facial lacerations, a 270-degree conjunctival peritomy, and complete transection of the inferior and medial rectus muscles and luxation of the entire globe out of the socket. They had taken him to the OR. Unable to find the cut ends of the rectus muscles, they simply closed the conjunctiva. And they were going to discharge him today, but his vision was hand motion, and they didn't know why. So in these countries, indirect ophthalmoscopy is not something that's commonly used. If you ask for the ophthalmoscope, someone typically has to go and find it, fish it out of a dusty cabinet, and hand it to you. But I had my indirect ophthalmoscope around my neck. He'd had a vitreous hemorrhage, which explained the hand motion vision. And a few days earlier, he had had a B scan, which showed there was no retinal detachment. So hopefully the vision would improve. But if not, there's one vitreoretinal surgeon for 120 million people in Ethiopia. The cost of getting there, The cost of surgery is beyond the reach of most of the population, and it's a rich man's procedure. As I finished examining the patient, I moved to an upright position, and I felt a strange sensation, sort of in my throat and sort of in my chest. I took a step back to feel my pulse, and something was wrong, and I knew what it was. This was the next picture that was taken in that room. Ever since I was in my late teens, I've had paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia, usually brought on by some postural change like this that had happened with the indirect ophthalmoscopy. My heart speeds up, I get a little short of breath, I valsalva to stimulate the vagus nerve, and within 10 seconds, I'm back to normal sinus rhythm. It's just part of my life, and I honestly don't really think about it. It happens maybe once a year. On rare occasions, valsalva doesn't work at all, and I have to do carotid massage. But even then, it's done within 30 seconds. But not on this day. I felt the familiar sensation. I immediately valsalvaed. Nothing. I tried it again. Nothing. I put my hand on my carotid and sat on the edge of the bed. Dr. Argyle asked me if I was okay. I tell him what's happening. Another minute passes. My heart's still racing. I'm starting to feel lightheaded. I lie down and I'm starting to worry. I've never been unable to break the SVT. Dr. Argyle asks me, should I call the ER? I think it's a good idea, I tell him. Minutes pass and I realize that my heart can't keep beating at this rate indefinitely. I know that one way or another the tachycardia is going to end. And I see very clearly that these moments right now in this room could be my very last moments. And I'm really rather surprised at how accepting I am of that. We're still waiting for the ER. My heart is racing. I think of my family and friends, of the call they would get and how abrupt it would all be. So I ask for my phone, open the voice recorder, and leave a message for them explaining what's happening and that I love them and know that they'll find the message if they need to. The critical care team arrives. Dr. Emmy, the head of the ICU, introduces herself, and I quickly let her know what's going on. They put in an IV, they connect the monitors, and see the pattern on the EKG. A narrow, complex SVT at 238 beats per minute. They spend another 5 minutes with various maneuvers to stimulate the vagus nerve. More valsalva, nothing. Gag reflex, nothing. Bilateral carotid massage, still nothing. The minutes are passing. Dr. Teresa is a surgical critical care fellow from Wisconsin who's been here for a month, helping the ICU raise its standards. David, your EKG is showing ST segment depression. Your heart is working hard and it's getting ischemic. We have to cardiovert you. We'll stop your heart and restart it. In my mind's eye, I see paddles, a jolt of electricity lifting me off the table, fully conscious. No, she explains, it's a chemical cardioversion. It will stop your heart. You'll feel absolutely horrible for a few seconds. And then, if all goes well, your heart will restart. If all goes well, I hear those words. And if it doesn't go well, we have paddles and we'll do CPR. And I've never seen anyone get CPR and leave an ICU alive. But it is what it is, and whatever's going to happen is going to happen. I tell Teresa to please write this down. I know that anything that is not written down now won't be remembered after a futile hour of coding me. She pulls out a pen. The password on my phone is 18444. Call my friend Ardawan. He'll call my wife. I turn to Emmy. Her face is strained. Emmy, look at me. I know this is difficult for you. You have a foreign doctor here in a bad situation. I have complete confidence in you. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Don't worry. We accept it. Thank you, she said, and she pushed the adenosine. After a few seconds, I felt a wave of doom wash over me, the effect of the drug, and I heard myself saying aloud, it's happening. The beeping on the monitor stopped. It was the most pervasive sound in the room until that meeting. I listened to the nothingness of those few seconds as my heart is stopped. The room is completely silent. and I'm wondering if this silence is the last thing I'm going to hear, but the beeping starts again, now a normal sinus rhythm. There's a collective sigh of relief, and I'm told that it was one of the last 4 vials of adenosine left in the hospital. They put me on a board and carry me down 4 flights of stairs to the ICU because the elevator hasn't been working for years. I'm hypotensive and tachycardic, and they determined that I wasn't able to pull out of the SVT because of dehydration. Ethiopia is at elevation, which can induce dehydration, but more importantly, I've been keeping myself dry because the bathrooms at the hospital were so horrible that I just didn't want to go in them. So they hydrate me, they stabilize me, and they consider it a victory. I tell them I want one more picture so I can show the world their excellent care. So I share this story not because of what happened to me, but because of what happened before this moment and its relevance to our work in global ophthalmology. 5 years ago, there was 1 critical care specialist at Hawassa Hospital. Now there are 7. 5 years ago, the odds of having someone available to help me would have been very slim. But for years, wave after wave of intensive care specialists, nurses, attendings, fellows, residents from programs across the United States have been visiting Hawassa, slowly, methodically building local capacity. Some stay a week, others like Teresa a month, some for 3 months. And until this experience, I'd often wondered, is spending a few hours during a single week teaching scleral tunnels to a few residents who have so few resources in a vast and expansive country, am I really doing anything? And all those people who worked over the years training ICU personnel in Hawassa probably wondered the same. But now, having been the beneficiary of the cumulative work over many years of people who were simply willing to go and to teach, I have no doubt that our work as teachers, no matter how brief, is useful and meaningful. And before I understood it in my mind, but now I understand it in my heart. The need to train ophthalmologists around the world is desperate. High-income countries, on average, have 60 ophthalmologists per million people, or about 1 in 17,000. By comparison, many low-income countries have less than 1 per 100,000. The most challenged have fewer than 1 per million. I've helped train scrub nurses in Honduras and Haiti, residents in Ethiopia and Tajikistan, seasoned ophthalmologists in Ecuador and Macedonia. Building capacity in eye care at all levels of eye care workers is a tremendous need and is an area that's open to any one of us. 31 years ago, when I left the United States, things were different. Going as a subspecialist would have made no sense. I would have been too specialized to be useful. But today, while the need still exists to go teach cataract surgery and comprehensive ophthalmology skills, there's a high demand for subspecialists to go and transfer their skills. Ethiopia now has an oculoplastic fellowship program as a result of one oculoplastic surgeon's regular visits over a decade to create a local oculoplastic surgeon who now heads the fellowship. Every subspecialty is needed. Corneal specialists carry tissue with them. They help create eye banks, rotations of retina surgeons, glaucoma specialists, pediatric ophthalmologists, uveitis specialists, even neuro-ophthalmologists are going and doing work, and we're all needed. There are many other areas to make impact in global ophthalmology, but these are 2 of the most immediate and the most accessible to go and provide the direct care and to build local capacity. So I'd like to shift a little bit. As I mentioned at the beginning, global ophthalmology is primarily work with the poor. It's the poor who have the worst access to care, and it's the poor nations where the highest prevalence of blindness exists. Cataract blindness is a disease of poverty, but in a true sense, cataract blindness is a symptom of poverty, a disease that creates other symptoms across all areas of an individual's life. 700 people drowning in a migrant boat in the Mediterranean is a symptom of poverty. So I'll share another story. In the early 1990s, Dr. Sanduk Ruit, the Nepalese ophthalmologist who would go on to pioneer manual small incision cataract surgery, was giving a presentation at the International Association for the Prevention of Blindness in Kathmandu. At the time, ECCE with lens implant was the well-established standard for cataract surgery in high-income countries, and phaco was becoming commonplace. And during those same years here at Northwestern, we were making the transition. My co-residents and I learned ECCE, then phaco, and our attendings were making that transition pretty much alongside us. In low-income countries around the world, well-intentioned international efforts had been underway for years to combat cataract blindness. But even in the early 1990s, the procedure of choice for cataract surgery in the global arena was aphakic intracapsular cataract surgery. It was quick, it was easy, and IOLs were considered too expensive. Dr. Ruit felt that the poor who could not access cataract surgery in the cities should be met in their own communities, and he pioneered taking cataract surgery to rural areas. This idea forms the basis of the Himalayan Cataract Project, which he would go on to co-found along with Jeff Tabin, who's now at Stanford. And those systems are being implemented around the world. He would take entire teams carrying all the necessary equipment, climbing for days into the mountain communities of Nepal, turning classrooms, monasteries, dispensaries into temporary operating rooms, and performing ECCE with IOL implantation. He felt the poor, more than those living in relative ease in high-income countries, needed excellent vision, and that it was an injustice to withhold modern surgery from them. So he collected his data of the safety and efficacy of ECCE with IOL in field operating rooms in rural settings, and he took the stage to present his findings to the global leaders assembled in Kathmandu. He anticipated an enthusiastic response because of the hope this offered to the poor. It was not to be. As he was presenting the data, an Indian ophthalmologist, a leading authority in world blindness, stood up and interrupted and said, "I've done my best to listen and keep my mouth shut, but this is nonsense. There are millions from Pakistan to Peking who need our services. And what you're talking about is simply too costly. Can we kindly turn our attention to more serious matters?" Then a high-ranking American public health official stood and applauded his Indian colleague. "You're wasting our time. Our resources are not infinite. It is only logical to make do with techniques that are proven in the field." Dr. Ruit was shocked, dumbfounded. He worked to keep his composure. He paused, he looked at his detractors, and asked 3 questions, which I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and which I feel captures the essence of one of the most fundamental challenges in global blindness. Not the lack of practical solutions, but rather the presence of entrenched patterns of thought that compromise our values and impede implementation of the practical solutions for the poor that do exist. Dr. Ruit stepped forward and asked 3 questions. Would you let your own mother or father be operated on with a technique 20 years out of date? Are you saying these millions, the poor, deserve less than you or I? Are you saying that they are the children of a lesser God? As I've contemplated this story over the years, I realize that Dr. Ruit, on a fundamental level, is asking for clarification of our values. Or rather, he's calling us to our values. He's reminding us of the principles upon which our work is based. He's calling our attention to three core values of global ophthalmology: equality, justice, and oneness. Would you let your own mother or father be operated on with a technique 20 years out of date? Calls to equality. Are you saying that these millions, the poor, deserve less than you or I, is calling us to justice? And are you saying that the poor are the children of a lesser God, is calling us to oneness? Taken together, these three values essentially express the idea of the equal value of every human life. Use these values, not the practical cost, to guide the work. With costs at the forefront, the conversation always ends with "it's too expensive," and the poor suffer. However, when principles take priority, we work to overcome limitations like cost or access or training or whatever, so that our lines of action are coherent with our values. We seek every way to operationalize those values. We keep our eyes on the values and we let them drive the solutions and approaches. So while every conversation in global ophthalmology implies equality, justice, and oneness, I think it will clarify our approaches and our activities to move those values to the front and center of the conversation, to articulate them clearly, to remind ourselves of them repeatedly. Then the pragmatic solutions will flow from the requirements of the principles, rather than compromising our values to suit the practical limitations. Do these millions, the poor, deserve less than you or I? Are you saying they are the children of a lesser God? Of course not, is the obvious answer. So why were the leaders in global ophthalmology advocating for aphakia for the poor? Why did they fail to see the inconsistencies of this approach with the values that form the basis of their work, that every life has equal value? As I contemplated this further, an uncomfortable question arose. Wait, do I have similar inconsistencies? If it happened to them, it can happen to me. Are there patterns of thought that I have inadvertently adopted? Are there unquestioned assumptions that I hold that affect how I consider the poor? Do they result in me acting in a way that is inconsistent with my belief in the equal value of every human life? And through my contemplation, I discovered that unfortunately there are. And I'll share a few with you for your consideration, not as a confession session, but because I think we can't tackle global blindness until we tackle poverty. And we can't tackle poverty without coming to terms with our own attitudes towards it. So first I realized that truly, deep down, I'm a thoroughly selfish human being. What prevents me from living fully coherently with my values is this very core drive of self-interest. It's been said that self-interest is kneaded into the clay of man. Self-interest prevents me from treating the life of the poor as having equal value to my own, and it prevents nations from treating lives in other nations as equal to their own. And it's hard for me to recognize that within myself, but I had to admit it was true. Most of us have or will have access to great wealth. With a modest sum of $5,000, I could fund 200 cataract surgeries. With something as simple as giving my money, I could move 200 people out of darkness into light without even leaving my couch. But somehow self-interest takes hold, and I think of how important it is for me to not sacrifice so much, to be cognizant of my own well-being. And so instead of restoring sight to 200 people on the other side of the world, I decide to spend on a family vacation. Self-care, I say. With those same funds that could have helped 200 people so profoundly, the 6 of us fly to the other side of the world where we'll walk around and look at stuff. Recognizing this inherent self-interest allows me to be honest when I daily bump up against my own values. With this consciousness, I work harder to subordinate my own personal interests for the well-being of the whole. I remind myself that if a candle's primary interest were its own well-being, it would never give forth light. But it all really makes me squirm. Self-interest can also creep in, even in the midst of this kind of service. At the end of the first day of my surgery in the Andes, I felt like I'd been hit by a bus. Every case had been difficult. Brunescent lenses, pseudoexfoliation, small pupils, traumatic lenses, no pupillary expanders, no dispersible viscoelastics, a phaco machine I didn't know, and a stool that didn't adjust, leaving me hunched over the microscope for hours. At the end of the day, I'm totally spent. I'm exhausted. I walk into the recovery room, still in my gown, curl up on one of the gurneys, and wonder why I do this to myself. It's not enjoyable, and these days are not uncommon, but immediately I catch myself. Dude, this is not about you. It's not about you having a good time or a comfortable day or an enjoyable experience. It's about the people. Stop thinking about yourself and do the work that needs to be done, and stop complaining about your own inconveniences. In the field, I have to have this conversation with myself nearly every day, because every day self-interest beckons me to life of comfort and ease. Our lives are so easy compared to the masses of humanity, but we really can get derailed by self-interest, and I have to work hard to keep its seductive whispers at bay. Beyond self-interest, are there other things that stand in my way of operationalizing my values when it comes to the poor? There are. I recently realized that I had picked up a lot of ideas about the value of the lives of the poor in a rather surprising place, on the wards and clinics of my medical education. I saw that there were things within my medical training that implied that the poor deserved less than those with means. Maybe it's different now. But at that time, I thought back to my days in training and how all the indigent clinics were the purview of the residents and medical students. Somehow it was okay for the poor to be left in the hands of the less experienced. But are not the diseases of the indigent more likely to be more advanced and more complex, in need of the most experienced physicians? And while it makes for excellent training to be in the trenches with so much complexity, just the fact that the poor filled these spaces must have tainted my thinking. Of course, this also came into play when deciding who would do the surgery. Is it the attending or the resident that operates on the investment banker, the doctor, the soccer mom? Did I inadvertently adopt the view that people of a certain social class deserve a higher level of care? That their lives or their sight somehow have higher value? Dr. Fred Hollows, the Australian ophthalmologist and a close collaborator of Dr. Rui, famously said, "Every eye is an eye," which to me means that it should make no difference in which socket it sits. I think back to the days of medical school in the South. There, when we were trying to decide who would do the surgery, the resident or the attending, we used the T to T ratio as the deciding factor, the tattoo to tooth ratio. The higher the ratio, the more chance of the resident getting the case. Beautifully irreverent, as a lot of medicine so often is, but within it I realized the thought had been planted within me that people of a certain class are indeed the children of a lesser God, ones that can settle for the higher risk of complications that come with resident surgery. Someone has to settle for that risk, the risk to train the next generation of doctors. But why the poor? Why do we not distribute the risk of suffering more evenly to the rich? These are just a few of the assumptions and thought patterns that I discovered within myself. And these same thought patterns interfere with our ability to operationalize our values as global ophthalmologists and as advocates for the poor. I'll just briefly touch on a few more questions. When we hold that success, particularly financial success, is a result of hard work and effort, do we not then also come to believe that poverty is the result of lack of hard work, lack of effort, and that poverty is somehow therefore self-inflicted or deserved? When we charge for health care, does it not automatically become a commodity that rightfully belongs to those who can pay for it? The countries that regard health as a human right, not as a commodity to be bought and sold, has successfully operationalized policies and health systems that separate access to health from access to wealth. When I try to minimize my personal taxes, am I not cutting the legs out from under the major source of funding for health coverage for the poor? Is it not inconsistent that I, as an advocate for equal access to health, look for strategies to minimize my taxes? Do I not believe that my individual interests should be subordinated for the common good? And finally, when we talk about people and their net worth, does this language influence our assumption that our value as human beings is connected to our financial worth? Because after all, when we say net worth, we're really just talking about financial worth. One of my favorite quotes about the concept of net worth states, "The happiness and greatness, the rank and station, the pleasure and peace of an individual have never consisted in his personal wealth, but rather in his excellent character, his high resolve, the breadth of his learning, and his ability to solve difficult problems." That's a definition of worth that helps me shift my perspective. So this is just a sampling of the sorts of assumptions and unexamined patterns of thought we may hold that seep into our work and undermine our applying equality, justice, and oneness, and may affect our attitudes and actions towards the poor. No one now would suggest leaving a poor patient a phakic simply because of the added cost of an IOL. But what other things are we maybe not seeing currently that perpetuate the conditions whereby the poor experience the world as if they are indeed the children of a lesser God? So I know that these aren't the kinds of topics that we typically talk about in ophthalmology, but global ophthalmology is an activity of bringing healthcare to those who do not have it, which turns out to be predominantly the poor. And so while we use the tools of medical science, global ophthalmology is also very much a social science. So given this, you may naturally ask, if blindness is such a vast and complex problem, affected by all kinds of forces outside the realm of our standard medical toolbox, how is this going to get better? How are we going to fix these things? It can seem overwhelming. And despite these challenges, I'm optimistic and confident about our future. Collectively, humanity has done a lot of great things, and we look nothing like we did 100 or even 50 years ago. As physicians, healthcare is our area and where we work to make our contribution to the advancement of civilization. I have such admiration for you here at Northwestern, working on the front lines of advancing knowledge to serve humanity and to end suffering. It's such noble work, and there are a lot of times when I wish I were doing this work in an academic center. And I have such pride for having been a part of this institution. In the global work, the poor are our trust. For those of you who may wish to engage in global ophthalmology, as you go forward, first think of Ananya and the millions of others around the world like her, and how you can personally play a role in moving them from darkness to light. It's highly rewarding work. Every time I remove a patch from a patient's eye standing in a field in Ethiopia or by a river in Papua New Guinea and see the smiles spread across their faces and the dancing that ensues, I look around at the other doctors and staff. Everyone is wiping their own tears. We're moved not because we have had anything to do with this, but simply because the suffering of another human being has ended, and we have the privilege of standing with them as they celebrate. As you're able, think of taking a week, a month, even a year. Go and give what you can. Second, go and teach. Think of the difference that waves of teachers make year after year and the impact it can have on a country over a generation. Remain cognizant that it took a lot of individual drops of water to carve the Grand Canyon. Remember me and the difference someone who trained Dr. Emmy made to me, and be confident that our work in teaching will make a difference to someone's life that we will never meet or even hear about. And third, ask yourself the questions Dr. Ruiz asked about our treatment of the poor. Delve into your own thought patterns. Look to uncover the unquestioned assumptions that result in individual actions or social systems that are not consistent with the principles of equal value of every human life. Move the principles of justice, equality, and oneness to the center of every conversation, and let the solutions flow from those values. Contain self-interest. Remember, it's not about you. And don't wait. Go into the area of poverty right here at home. The work is everywhere, and I'll help you in any way I can. Thank you for the very kind invitation and the privilege of being here. It really, truly is an honor. I never expected when I left Northwestern that one day what I was doing out in the middle of nowhere would one day bring me back here. So I thank you, and happy to take any questions.